So the Flick era has truly arrived with his first competitive La Liga match. There were plenty of positives for Barcelona, especially in possession, but Flick had strange defensive tactics that meant they looked extremely vulnerable at the back and must improve this if they're to challenge for La Liga. So let's first look at their pressing shape. It all began when Valencia had the ball deep, as Barcelona, in a hybrid 4-3-3, 4-2-3-1, rather than shifting into a 4-4-2 with a winger coming narrow or a central midfielder pushing up from deep, they wanted to press the centre-backs in a different way. It was the wingers, Yamal and Ferran, who were tasked with coming from out wide onto the centre-backs to tie them up, while Lewandowski and Rafinha were expected to join the midfield and cover Valencia's double pivot, who were playing in a 4-4-2. So it meant Barcelona's own shape looked like a 4-2-2-2. This left them hugely vulnerable in the wide regions, where the expectation was for Bernal and Casado to handle both the central areas and move out wide whenever the Valencia fullbacks received the ball. But this was far too much room to cover, not to mention that they still had to worry about the wide midfielders, who could stay on the touchlines, or we often saw a lopsided shape with Mir or Almeida moving in to tie up a pivot. So Flick's defensive shape had to be more adaptable. Whenever Valencia looked to play the chip ball into the right back, Balde was extremely front-footed, looking to prevent them from progressing up their right-hand side. However, this had knock-on effects, as it now meant that there was a gaping hole behind Balde, and Valencia were aggressive in taking advantage of this space, often through Mir or more commonly Almeida making runs into that region to get on the end of a ball, potentially disorienting Barcelona's defensive shape and leaving the centre a lot more vulnerable. To avoid this, and because Barcelona did not want their defenders to be 1v1, they tended to shift into more of a 3, with Koundé tucking in more to allow slightly better coverage of these wide regions. But leaving those wingers high meant that Barcelona still had huge problems, except now it was down the left, because Lopez would stay high and wide consistently, unlike Mir, and this would push Koundé here, allowing Vasquez to push much higher and wider, meaning he could be found in the wider regions, and now Valencia had escaped the press. And this is exactly what happened for the Valencia goal, as Ferran and Yamal are caught high, pressing the centre-backs, and this time the Valencia left-back makes himself available to receive, while Koundé is pinned deep by the winger. So now Valencia can walk into the Barcelona final third, and Koundé is 2 versus 1 down, or perhaps 1v1 at best, meaning Lopez doesn't have to work particularly hard to create the space and cross, leading to the goal. It was not an effective defensive shape at all, and even in more open play, the Barca wingers still found themselves fairly central and slow to get back to protect the wide regions, meaning Valencia manipulated the Barcelona backline pretty easily. This was simply through Mir and Almeida operating fairly centrally, meaning Balde often had no option but to move in with his man, exposing this massive gap. And Correa was never slow to look to attack the space and then get the opportunity to cross. But the only advantage of this shape was what it offered Barcelona on the transition. While the wingers were caught high and central and were slow to defend, it meant that whenever Valencia's attacks broke down, Barcelona had the chance to hit hard and fast on the break, with Ferran and Rafinha making consistent runs into the space and looking to create opportunities. But in contrast to all of this, Barcelona looked really good in the attacking phase, creating over 3 expected goals. And while the expectation was for them to line up in the 4-2-3-1 with Rafinha just off of Lewandowski, this was rarely the case, especially in the first half. Barcelona primarily used a double diamond that saw Rafinha and Casado either side of Bernal, and early on in the build-up, both fullbacks remained deep and wide. And Valencia tried to be passive in their 4-4-2, as they knew they would be outnumbered in the midfield. So Almeida and Duro would, as much as possible, look to remain deep to tie up Bernal. They would only occasionally press, either ensuring the pivot was covered with their cover shadow, or using a piston press. The reason for Valencia being so reluctant to press is shown here, as Duro gets his angles wrong, so Bernal isn't in his cover shadow. The pivot now has plenty of room and finds Torres running in behind. This was a mini battle, as by using this shape and keeping the centre backs extremely wide, Barcelona were looking to force the Valencia forwards to cover a lot of room by moving side to side, tiring them out for later in the match. But higher up in the attack, we're slowly beginning to see Flick's tactical fingerprints as the dynamism and verticality he loves were on full display. Lewandowski tended to move deeper to offer an option, and he would be flanked by two men, either the 8 if they were both high, or if Casado was deeper as a second pivot, Ferran would move more centrally. Crucially, whenever Lewandowski moved deep and drew a centre back, these men were consistently expected to make runs in behind, either to receive a flick from Lewandowski or a direct pass in behind, and this caused plenty of danger. But it was the wide areas where all the action happened for Barcelona, as the right and left hand sides were used extremely differently. The right hand side was primarily used for progression, and with Flick, we didn't see any inversion in possession on either side. And Koundé moved high up, often becoming the highest man, as Barcelona created this triangle on the right hand side. Rafinha and Yamal rotated a fair bit, and as two left-footed players, whenever they received the ball, they had the entire pitch opened up to them, naturally allowing them to play piercing passes, or, because Valencia only had a 2 in the midfield, whenever this overload began down Barcelona's right, they would be forced across the pitch, potentially creating space in central regions that Casado would be happy to move into as a more attacking option. Or, this trio were often able to work their way into zone 14 through intricate build-up play. The left-hand side, however, is where Hansi Flick won his first La Liga game. It wasn't used for possession's sake, but rather pure penetration. With the centre-back spreading wide, Balde became a huge factor, receiving high up and often drawing in the Valencia fullback. Why the fullback and not the wide midfielder? Well, Torres would move centrally aggressively, dragging the midfielder with him, and then either he or Casado would look to create an option for Balde to pass into. But the attacking threat became a real issue for Valencia when Barcelona delayed the pass into Balde, as Ferran would tie up the fullback as well, while Mia had moved inside to try and prevent the midfield overload. This would mean Balde had all the space in the world, as we saw again and again. Crucially, this led to Barcelona's equaliser, with both Ferran and Casado central, freeing up Balde to receive. He has plenty of room to line up the cross, which is knocked back by Yamal on the far side, allowing the finish. Overall, it's the first competitive game for Flick, so of course there will be kinks to work out. It was admittedly a shaky start defensively, meaning Flick earns a 5. But what did you think? Drop your rating down below. And check out how this setup is completely different from Flick's first match by clicking on the video on screen now.